hide the starry skies. But just a little talk with Jesus clears the way. Now let us have a little talk with Jesus. Let us tell him all about our troubles. He will hear our faintest cry, and he will answer by and by. Now when you feel a little prayer wheel turning, you will know a little fire is burning. You will find a little talk with Jesus makes it right. I may have doubts and fears, my eyes may fill with tears, but Jesus is a friend who watches day and night, day and night. I go to him in prayer, he knows my every care, and just a little talk with Jesus makes it right, makes it right. Let us have a little talk with Jesus. Let us tell him all about our troubles. He will hear our faintest cry. He will answer by and by. Now when you feel a little prayer wheel turning, you will know a little fire is burning. You will find a little talk with Jesus makes it right. Now let us have a little talk with Jesus. Let us tell him all about our troubles. He will hear our faintest cry, and he will answer by and by. Now when you feel a little prayer wheel turning, you will know a little fire is burning. You will find a little talk with Jesus. Find a little talk with Jesus. Find a little talk with Jesus makes it right. Have a little talk with Jesus.
2 Corinthians 9, verses 1 through 15. Now it is not necessary for me to write you about the ministry to the saints, for I know your eagerness, which is the subject of my boasting about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Acacia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I am sending the brothers in order that our boasting about you may not prove to have been empty in this case, so that you may be ready as if you would be me. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, in this undertaking. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead of you and arrange in advance for this bountiful gift that you have promised, so that it may be ready as a voluntary gift and not as an extortion. The point is this: the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in every good work. As it is written, he scatters abroad, he gives to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for your great generosity, which will produce thanksgiving to God through us. For the rendering of this ministry not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also overflows with many thanksgivings to God. Through the testing of this ministry, you glorify God by your obedience to the confession of the gospel of Christ, and by the generosity of your sharing with them and with all others, while they long for you and pray for you, because of the surpassing grace of God that he has given you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift.
I have heard countless preachers preach on stewardship in my life. And like many of you, I've heard some good, inspiring sermons on that topic, as well as those that came across as nothing more than guilt-trip-laden threats or something that looked like a PBS telethon where you were promised fabulous prizes for upping your pledge to the $200 level. I have sat in the pews, this is real, and heard a pastor describe those that did not give to their capital campaign as the spies in the book of Numbers that died of a plague because they didn't believe that Moses would be able to win the promised land. If that is not a threat, then I don't know what is. I've heard preachers put words in God's mouth promising that God will make you rich if you are willing to give more to their church and to their ministry. And I've heard preachers delicately, beautifully, tap dance around a sermon about giving without uttering the word money, as if the very mention of the word was too evil to be spoken out loud from the pulpit, as if they believed that the people that God had called them to speak to could not handle hearing that word, even though deep down everybody knew that money is what kept the lights on. Now, for years, I have heard these messages. I have listened to them. And I told God something a long time ago. I told God that if God ever picked me to preach on giving and on stewardship, that I wouldn't do any of that. That I wouldn't guilt people or threaten them. That I wouldn't try to coerce them into giving with false promises of future wealth and all their dreams coming true. And that I wouldn't be afraid to say what needed to be said, even if that meant using the word money. That I would be simple and honest about what giving is and what it should be and why it is a wonderful and necessary part of our faith. Now, I tell you this because, of course, I promised this to God because I believed and knew that God would never call me to deliver such a message. God and I had already agreed that I was a youth minister, and I'd never seen a youth minister be asked to do that. And now, here I am. I tell you all of this because I want you to know that what I share with you over these next 2 Sundays, as we talk honestly about giving, I take seriously. Not just as your pastor, but because I made a promise to God that I intend to keep. So I'm going to give you a spoiler warning right now. I'm not going to guilt you or threaten you so that you're going to give. If that's what you're hoping for, I apologize. That's not going to happen. I'm not going to promise you that your giving will help you win the lottery or earn you a new car. And if that's what you're hoping for, I apologize. But not really, because I don't have the power to give that to you. And I'm not going to hide or pretend that money is not a part of what many of us are called to give. What I'm going to do is what God called me to do. To share with you honestly, simply, openly, and truthfully what giving has always been about. It's about joy. It's about thanksgiving and hope. It's about faith and community. And above all, it's about blessing. And I'm just young and naive enough to believe that our giving can still be about all those things. And I'm just young and naive enough to believe that if we give because of all those things, that powerful things will happen. The Apostle Paul certainly agreed. The scripture that was read for us this morning is part of a letter that Paul is writing to a church in Greece that he started. This church is one of many that were among the first Christian churches in the world. Many started even before people were using the word Christian to describe themselves and their faith. Knowing this is important because it reminds us that what is being told and taught to them is the basis and the foundation of everything that we as members of Christian churches are taught to do. Paul is writing this letter to them to remind them about a gift that they promised a year before. Back then, Paul told this church in Greece about the needs of the poor Christians in Jerusalem. And this Greek church, filled with faith and surrounded by abundant blessings, promised to provide for those Christians in Jerusalem. They looked at everything that they had and everything that they were earning and promised to give bountifully out of their abundance to their suffering brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. Paul is not writing to them to urge them to give because they've already said they're going to. Look at how he starts this letter. Now it is not necessary for me to write to you about the ministry of the saints. Other translations are far more clear here. I like the Good News translation. It was written for a 5th grade reading level, and it is still one of my favorites. In the Good News translation, it says, "There is really no need for me to write to you about the help being sent to God's people in Judea." Paul starts his letter by telling the people of this church that are reading it and hearing it that it's really not necessary for him to have written it in the first place. Paul already knows that they have promised to help. He has spent the entire year since their promise telling other people about it. Paul is writing to them to make sure they're ready to make good on that promise, to share what he hopes their giving will look like and why he hopes they are given in the first place. Paul wants them to know what giving means. These are lessons that were not just important then, but are important today. As we sit in this sanctuary, 5,333 miles from that early church, and 2,000 years later, we still need to hear about what giving is. Giving is something that we should do thoughtfully. It's not something flippant and frivolous, done on a whim or offered quickly without thought or concern. It must be much more than just dumping our change in the tip jar at the bakery counter without even looking or counting how much it is. Paul states that each of the people in his church should give as they have made up their mind. He wants them to be intentional as they consider what they have to give, what God has blessed them with, and why they give it at all. Think about when you tip a waiter or a waitress at a restaurant. There is a significant difference between taking their exceptional service into account when we write down their tip on the receipt than when we simply move the decimal point over and leave without considering them at all. When we tithe, when we give 10% of what we have, it needs to be about more than math, but a deep consideration about what we have to offer and what we hope that tithe will be used for. If we tithe without thought or concern, we miss out on the dreams of what the tithe might do and what it says about how we have been blessed to be able to give it. Giving must be voluntary. It must be something that we choose to do knowing we have the freedom not to. It must be something that is not forced on us through guilt or pressure or fear or compulsion. Paul tells the people that he is writing them this letter so that when Titus and these 2 brothers in the faith that Paul will send to come to them to collect the pledge that they've already promised, Paul tells them this so they'll be ready to give voluntarily when those guys arrive. Paul is not sending these men to shake this church down. That is not his goal, is sending Titus and these other guys. Because extortion isn't giving. Christ has never been in the business of blackmail or compulsion. Paul and this church know better than anyone what it feels like to give this way. Paul grew up in an Israel, a promised land overrun by the Romans, who regularly compelled God's people to do whatever they asked him to do. to give whatever they ask them to give by threat of prison, violence, or death. God's people had to pay a tax just to practice their faith. That is not the kind of giving that Paul wants for this church. He wants the exact opposite. He wants his church to give because they want to, not because they have to or because they're scared not to. There is a massive difference between giving your time to come to church because you want to be here than because you're afraid not to be here. There's a massive difference between caring for your neighbor out of love and genuine concern than because it's just your turn on the schedule. When we give because we choose to, we cannot help but give eagerly and cheerfully. Giving done right is a cause for celebration, for joy, even when it might seem silly to others that we should feel this way. Think about when you've been on a mission trip or worked on those habitat houses a few weeks ago. I was there watching you work. And at that habitat build, I watched as you gave of your Saturday to paint houses for hours, a job that on paper is both slow and boring and dirty. And I watched as you smiled and laughed while you were doing it. When you give for the right reasons, joy just becomes a part of it naturally. I have ripped out waterlogged insulation from people's flood-damaged homes with many of you. I have built homes in Africa out of sticks with tools that were barely able to do that job and could not escape your joy as you toiled through the heat, humidity, bugs, and dirt. I've seen when you've given your time at Operation Inasmuch or the North Carolina Veterans Nursing Home because you chose to be there. And I have borne witness to what giving out of joy looks like. When we give this way, it's not just our giving that's different. We are different. And our joy causes us, without even realizing it, to work harder and love more deeply than we even thought we could. The way we give financially can and should be the same. The reality is when we give like this, it's hard for others not to notice our joy, not to want to share in it. In this way, how we give models to those around us how we're supposed to give. Paul begins his letter by telling this church exactly that. He starts by letting this church know that he has been telling other churches how eager and abundantly this church that he's writing to promised to give last year. And he tells this church in Greece what happened when he shared that information with those other churches. When those other churches heard how excited that church in Greece was to give, then the people there started to do the same. Our giving to God can be a model for others what giving looks like. And it should be, because it can't help it. Now, this can be seen, I'll share with you the best example I know of how this happens. I've seen it most clearly in the children of every single church that I have ever been in when the offering plate goes around. Watch what they do when those plates get walked up the aisle. Those kids start getting excited with anticipation. With every step that person takes, they inch closer to the front of their pew. Oh, at a point where I almost feel like they're going to fall forward and hit their face on the hymnal. They clutch their quarters or their pennies that have been handed to them, and they look forward to watching it go into that plate because it's exciting to them. They get to be a part of this, and it makes me excited to watch. What they give, that little bit of change, always becomes something more by how they give it. Always. And I can say this because I've watched again and again the way the adults that sit beside them, who go after them to put their offering and their pledges in the plate, once they see those kids give in that way, they give differently. They can't help it. that excitement, that exuberance of that child wanting to be a part of that, of putting those little pennies in that plate, makes us want to give with that same kind of joy. The same is true for missions. The work teams that I've sent out to complete their jobs too quickly, the ones that force the volunteer organizations that I'm working with to have to find more for them to do because they got done with a week's worth of work in a day, those are always the groups that have that one person in them. That one person that cannot hide their joy for serving and giving. Often that person is not the most qualified or the most coordinated or the most skilled or the most physically capable. They're just the most joyful. They're those people that drop the insulation as they're trying to walk into the house, but they're singing while they do it. And the whole rest of the team ends up working harder and more excitedly because that person's there. And their joy in giving welcomes us to be a part of it. It inspires us and it links us together in ministry. Giving is a way for all of us to be a part of the ministry together. If you look at verse 11, Paul uses the word us in that verse. He is including himself with the church that he is writing to when he says that their generosity will produce thanksgiving to God through us. Paul knows that most of those Christians will not be joining him when he brings their gifts to the people in need in Jerusalem. He knows that. But he is sharing with them that even though they won't be physically there with him on the mission field, their gift makes them a vital part of that ministry. Their gift makes them just as important as the people that they have sent and commissioned to care for their neighbors in Christ's name. I want you to look at those shoe boxes. Look at those shoe boxes and see that that's the same thing we believe when we take part in that ministry. We're not going to be boarding the planes to distribute those boxes all over the world. But when we fill them and we turn them in, we recognize that we are vital parts of that ministry. Our gifts are what make that ministry of those missionaries that will deliver those boxes possible. Our giving to our church should be the same. When we pass around the benevolence box on Wednesday nights and put dollar bills in recognition of birthdays and anniversaries, each of us becomes a vital part of the daily ministry to our downtown friends that money makes possible, even if we are not the ones using it to help them. When we put money in the offering plate, when we pledge to give to our church, we become a part of the ministry of every single missionary that we support. Every seminary student who receives a scholarship, every local service organization that we enable, and every person whose life is changed because they have walked into this place. And this certainly doesn't just apply to monetary offerings. When we give of our abilities to teach Sunday school, to sing in the choir, to paint the walls of this building, to arrange the flowers, and above all, to pray for one another. Our gifts join us to 180 years of ministry that have been happening for generations of people that have called this church home. These offerings multiply in ways that they never dreamed of and that we have never dreamed of. But they all point to God. They create what I like to think of as this massive, ever-expanding chorus of thanksgiving for the grace that God has given to us. Paul calls it a harvest of righteousness. That's the goal of giving, a harvest of God's righteousness. You notice that that's not about us. A harvest of God's righteousness is about God. It's not giving if we attach certain stipulations or requirements to it. A harvest of righteousness is not about status on earth or in heaven. Giving can't be about us trying to earn more grace or more money or new cars because we upped our pledge and we think we deserve it. Giving is about God using our gifts to expand and spread a righteousness that will endure forever. Put simply, our choice to give is why God gave us gifts in the first place. It's what we were created to do. So I told you that I wanted to be as simple as possible when I talk about what giving is. I don't want to beat around the bush. I don't want to hit you over the head. I don't want to threaten you. I just want to be simple and honest. And I cannot think of a more simple and honest way to talk about giving than this. God made us in God's image. So at the very core of who we are called to reflect God. And I'm convinced that there's no greater reflection of a God that gives life, gives salvation, gives redemption, gives blessings, and gives grace out of love alone than to give out of our abundance of all of these same things for that same reason. It's simple. And I think the simplicity of it is what makes it right and what makes it real. So my hope, my dream, it's not just us, but all of God's people. Can you imagine what would happen if we all went to God and asked what we were called to give and were willing to do exactly that? I don't think our world would be ready for that kind of church unleashed upon it. Amen. Many of you may have received this blue card in the mail. It looks familiar because we have done this every year that I've been here. It's a very different kind of pledge card. What this is a card that has a space for financial blessings, but it also has a space for those other gifts. The gifts of time and the talents that you have been given, that you have no idea how God is going to use, but you have them to offer. Next week, we're going to be invited to turn these in. And I wrote a letter, just like Paul did this week, to y'all about this. And the letter I thought I was going to write and the letter I wrote were different. I thought I was going to write a letter explaining this, explaining what blessings were. I wrote a letter about how to pray. I didn't know that that's what God wanted me to do, but that's the letter I ended up writing. So I echo what God spoke to me through that letter. That I do want you to fill this out. I want you to consider what you have to offer and to share, but I don't want you to do it before you pray. Ask God what you've been given. Thank God for what you have, and ask God all the ways you can use those gifts for God's glory. Again, you may not know how your word processing skills might be useful, but I believe we can find a way. So that's what I invite us to do. This is an invitation, a charge to pray.
With Jesus Christ.